Ah, welcome back to the beginning of our lecture for this week on art and media. So let's go ahead and jump into this. So, to understand art and media through an anthropological lens, we have to sort of talk about what is art, right? And art covers a lot of things, right? Art can be everything from this list of music, literature, storytelling, paintings, theater, design, sculpture, architecture, clothing, food, games, martial arts. All of these different things can qualify as some type of art, right? That we each engage in. Sometimes it can be mundane, everyday stuff where it isn't artistic, like food, right? You know, if you're at home and you're making some mac and cheese, is that art? Well, some people would say probably not, unless you go that extra mile, right? And you add in all these different flavors and garnishes and how you plate that mac and cheese, right? Can then all of a sudden go from the mundane to the artistic. You know, so good you don't want to eat it, but it's mac and cheese. And I'll share something with you. I can't stand mac and cheese. Macaroni, yes. Cheese, yes. Put them together, ew. I don't know what it is. Anyway, but you can turn it into something artistic. So it all kind of depends on what it is that you're doing and what kind of effort you put into it. Mostly, and we're going to go into this here. So let's talk about art and media. So we have to understand that art and media itself is that it's transmitted, right, from a creator to an audience. So we have to have someone that's making that and someone that's observing or consuming that. And by consumption, I'm not just talking about eating, right, but I'm talking about how we consume all types of art. So watching television, going to a museum, going to an art gallery, you know, all these different things can, you know, be can be consumption, right? We can consume all these things. We also have to understand that we live in sort of this Western cultural ideology when it comes to art. We have certain ideals about what is artistic. Okay. We also have to understand that we sort of organize our art in different ways within Western culture. We have fine art, and we're going to define what fine is. We have public art, right, which is oftentimes or popular art that's mass consumption. We have primitive art, and we're going to talk about what primitive means because we have very distinct ideas on these different concepts of art and how each of these play into Western culture, you know, and where do we place things and why do they get tossed or lumped in to these different groups and what does that mean? We have, I think one of the most important things to understand, though, as an anthropologist, is that while we do create these distinctions between fine and popular and primitive art, we don't see them as necessarily greater than another, right? We have to understand that while one culture might see this as fine art, and this is popular art, and this is primitive art, we're not necessarily going to be putting qualities to those, right? We're going to try and understand why is it considered this, right? Not necessarily us considering it that, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? We understand that art can be simple, it can be complex, it's symbolic, it can be shared, it can be coveted. All of these things, all these different attributes can be connected to art and how we consume it, and how it can be, again, considered fine versus popular versus primitive, right? Is how it's viewed, how it's consumed, how it's recorded, all of these different things. So as we look at these different ideas on art, it's important to basically try and understand why a culture places value. So if we, in Western culture, we have to ask the question, who makes art? Okay, so we oftentimes consider artists to be either, you can have like a professional artists or amateur artists, right? There are a lot of amateur artists out there, and that's what, people do art for fun. They do art for their own personal consumption. They do art for to hang up on their walls or to put on a shelf or something like that. And that's that amateur style art that might not be considered to be professional grade. The stuff that you might actually go buy at a store, right, or an art gallery, and where you might hang it up, prominently in your home. And maybe you're not an artist. Maybe there's something that that you just don't engage in that, but you still appreciate it. Where do you put that art in relation to into your home? We talked about sort of like some of the basic ideas behind art when it comes to how we incorporate it into our daily lives. From everything from cooking, how do you plate that meal, your mac and cheese masterpiece, to doodling, right? What is your daily thing? Do you do any type of art? Do you play music, or do you sing? Do you draw? Do you do any of that stuff? We have art in our daily lives. We have art that we consume on the radio, right? If you're driving down the street or you're on the bus or you're walking, you might have your earphones on or you got the radio blasting. We're consuming that art on a regular basis. Anytime that you drive by a billboard, right? Is that art? It is, actually. It is considered artwork in some way. Because even though it's like advertising, there is a thought process that goes into that advertising. There is a way that we can look at that art and say, okay, what is the message that's coming across? Is it interesting enough for me to look at? What's drawing me in? What's the color scheme? What's the text look like? What's it trying to tell me? So there's that kind of stuff as well. We oftentimes have to look at art when we're doing our research, and I oftentimes find art to be one of the most important aspects of doing anthropological work. And the reason is because it can give you a very interesting insight into that culture. It allows you to see sort of the conscious and unconscious mind of that community. What are the things that they find important? And how do they depict those things? If you've got a community that I'll just take graffiti writers. If you've got an area that has a lot of graffiti writers, where and what are they trying to say when they're doing this style of art? What is the message? Sometimes you've got people that are putting up a distinct message that, hey, Black Lives Matters, or um, you know, uh, fight the police. I've seen that quite a bit, right? Especially lately when it comes to graffiti. Other graffiti writers don't have a message. Sometimes it's all about getting their name up, right? Just spray painting their name out there so that other people see it. So there can be different motivations behind different artists. And understanding how that community deals with those various issues can be really important to sort of go forward in your research and say, okay, so graffiti writers are, they're very much into their art. They do different types of art through, big murals to doing tags, and sometimes there's a message. Sometimes it's just to tag things. Sometimes it's vandalism, and sometimes it's making a community brighter with these cool pieces of artwork. Both are a part of that community. There's a positive side, there is a negative side, and we have to try and understand what those sides are and how they fit into that community, and understand that you might have an artist that does both, right? So we understand that oftentimes art can lead us in a way that can help us understand the community. A lot of times we will also research a lot about popular art because oftentimes it's the most highly consumed art. It's what's out there in prominent display. And so we'll take a look at that and try and understand, what's going on. Why are we seeing this everywhere? Why is it so prominent? And we'll focus on that as well. Doesn't mean that we're not going to look at subculture and what kind of art is going on there, or what is considered to be fine art as we discover it. But because popular art is popular, it is a big aspect of what we're looking at. And it helps us to get an understanding of that community. The thing about public art or popular art is that sometimes it doesn't always represent the community, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. So we also look at the distinctions. What makes fine art fine, right? What makes it so important that we idolize it? Versus popular art. Why is that easily consumable? And what makes those distinctions? Oftentimes fine art, if we're looking at Western culture, will sometimes have a religious tone to it. If we look at some of what we consider to be our finest artists, our apex artists, oftentimes they're connected to the church. Michelangelo and all of these fantastic artists, that's where their art is oftentimes prominently placed, is within these religious institutions. So why is that? Or when it comes to music, we say that like classical music or ballet are the finest forms of music and dance. Why? Why is that the case? Why is it that in our society we hold these different forms of art to be at such a high level, right? Why do we consider them to be so important? And a lot of that comes down to exclusivity, right? Who has access to it, right? Going to see the orchestra, going to see the ballet, can sometimes be expensive, right? It's oftentimes not cheap. So financially, it's exclusive. right? Sometimes you to just go or even go on a regular basis is quite the feat financially to be able to do. So that's one thing, to make it important is to make it exclusive and to put it out of reach of others who might not have access to it. So that could be part of it as well. One of the things that we also have to look at is sort of the ideas of aesthetics and logic, right? What is aesthetically pleasing, and what do we consider to be logical, right? And these things don't always match. And sometimes, when it comes to like abstract art, it can be really interesting to look at. And maybe it fights the logical side, and that's what makes it interesting. The thing about art is that it also challenges, right? Art can go beyond what we normally think of while we're doing our everyday thing. We might see an image of something. We might see a symbol or something like that that has this design to it, that has this message attached to it. That challenges our normal thought pattern, our normal ideas. And that's where art can be extremely powerful, is in that challenging or in that reaffirming aspect, right? If we see something over and over and over and over again, then we might be more easily accepting of that concept. Pay attention to like the commercials that you watch if you're watching TV or something like that. What are you seeing over and over again? Why is Coca-Cola so prominent? Why do they have so much advertising? And why is their advertising generally really good? And why do they show it all the time? Anytime you turn on the TV, somewhere you're going to see an advertisement for like Coca-Cola or something like that. Why is that prominent? And what makes it art? I mean, it's a drink, and it's a bad drink. It's not healthy for you to drink Coca-Cola. It's not a good thing. It's loaded with sugar and all kinds of crap. I drink it, so but it's bad. But we consume it at a massive level, right? As a country, we consume it on a regular basis. But why is that? Well, we're shown all these different things that influences us in a subtle way, right? Not necessarily in an overt way, but in a subtle way. Different ways to get you to buy their product. I think one of the interesting things about Coca-Cola, and I know they've done this for a number of years, and I think they're still doing it, but they were putting people's names on like the bottles or the cans of Coke, right? They'd start putting all these different names on there, and you'd see your name. It's like, oh man, there's a Coke bottle or with my name on it. I gotta get it. Or you got a buddy of yours that's you see a Coke bottle with their name on it. It's like, oh, I gotta get that because it's cool, right? Is it cool? Is it? Maybe. Maybe it's cool because Coca-Cola told us it was cool. Anyway, so art can be highly influential, either influencing or challenging our ideas on stuff all the time. And it can go really well or it can go very poorly. One of the things that I always found fascinating was when Barack Obama was running for president. And I'm sure you all remember the poster of Obama with the red, white, and blue, and right underneath it had these big words that spelled hope, right? There's this big poster, and the color scheme was really impressive. You got the red, white, and blue. you've got this black and white caricature of Obama, and then you've got hope underneath it. And that's artwork, right? And that's consumable artwork. And it brings along this, this idea about this concept of democracy and, and goodness and all this stuff, right? It's trying to convey all of this information and do it in a way that is aesthetically pleasing, right? Interesting to look at, not just a normal photograph, but something a little bit more thought out, right? One of the things that is really important to understand as well, and I've talked about this in a lot of other different ways throughout the semester, talking about culture and how important culture is. Culture determines what we consider to be beautiful. Okay, so what does that mean? What do we mean by culture determines what is beautiful? Well, you might go to another culture and you might show them something that you consider to be beautiful. And they might look at you and go, "Are you nuts? That's not beautiful. That is ugly as sin." And you're going to be like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. This is beautiful, right? This is very beautiful." Culture determines what we consider to be beautiful. And globalism can have a huge impact on what we consider to be aesthetically pleasing. An example, and this is one of those examples that is heartbreaking, but I think it's really important to understand. So one of the things that's happening around the world right now is that American hegemony, right? We've got this American cultural push, and we've got TV shows and movies and stuff that's going out there. And who is the face of most of these TV shows and most of these movies, right? It's white people, right? You got white people that are the face of this. And because it's a hegemonic power, right, that influence is going to places all around the world. And what's ended up happening in a lot of countries, even our own, is that people will see the lighter their skin is, the more attractive they become within that culture. Even if you're in a culture that is predominantly African or Hispanic or whatever, the lighter your skin, the better you look. And it's a part of this hegemonic push, right? Because of all of our movies, and it becomes influential in these cultures. And you have this aversion where people who might have darker skin will go out and get their skin lightened. Or if you've got lighter skin, you'll avoid going out and getting a tan so that you don't have that darker skin. So we've got this cultural push coming from the United States, and not necessarily intentionally doing it, but people are seeing this and they're like, well, that's what attractive is, right? We're seeing that this is the type of person, this is the woman that gets the guy, right? This is the successful person. This is the beautiful person. And what do they look like? It has an impact. And people are adjusting within their cultures outside of the United States to try and be lighter in complexion. And, because that's what they believe is more attractive. And it's what we believe here in the United States. It's what a lot of people assign attractiveness to. And it's absolutely unfortunate that this is the case, because it shouldn't be, right? It really shouldn't. So, you know, cultures define what is beautiful, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it can have unintended consequences of what is considered attractive or pleasing. If we go back in time, and in other cultures too, here in the United States, we value the skinny, right? The fit and the skinny. And that's what we see as attractive. Now, if we go back 150 years in this country, if you were that skinny, if you were rail thin, you would be considered sick, right? Because you obviously weren't eating enough. And the attractive people were people that had a little bit more girth, right? And that's because that was seen as a sign of wealth. Because if you had a little bit of wealth, you could eat well. And so now you're like, yeah, I've got a little bit extra poundage because I can afford it and I can strut around and look good. And that would be seen as more attractive than the skinny because, I couldn't afford to be healthier and eat more and actually put some pounds on. So that, at that time, is considered to be attractive. There are groups around the world that see body size in different ways, and how big you are or how small you are can be seen differently as far as attractiveness goes. So it all depends. It all depends on your culture. And the reflection of that, can have moderate levels of impact. In our culture, we are bombarded with information about health and wellness because we also have a very high level of obesity in this country. And so, anytime that you are listening to the radio or, again, consuming that media, right, you're bombarded with different ways of getting skinnier, right? And so this becomes a drive within a society, what's appropriate. We see Coca-Cola, which everybody wants to drink because it looks cool and it tastes good and all that stuff, but, it's cool, which has that impact on, whether or not you're going to be skinny or not, right? So there's all kinds of conflicting information in there. Okay, so for an exercise, I'm not going to have you do this because I've already got you guys doing discussion and all that stuff. What do we consider to be aesthetically pleasing as a culture, right? What do we consider to be beautiful? And they can be different things. When I think about beauty from a personal point, from my own experience, I really like old cars, muscle cars, cars from like the 1940s that have got these really smooth, like sort of like airplane design. They almost look like they could just take off and fly, right? You strap some wings and a propeller on it, and man, they just gone. I find that aesthetically pleasing, right? Whenever I see those kinds of cars, I'm like, yeah, that's really cool. And then all of a sudden, one will come out, and it'll be like just gorgeous, just beautiful, like a cool 1941 Chevy panel truck. So, oh my God, I love those things. What else? What else do I find, particularly beautiful? Um, that's dogs, right? There are some dogs that are just aesthetically pleasing, right? And we see this, right? We see this in different trends of dog owners. I've got I'll show you a picture of Bear, but he's Malamute and Australian Shepherd. He's a mutt. There's a few other things in there, but we believe that he's mostly Malamute and Australian Shepherd. And he's the best looking boy ever. Oh my God. So whenever I see other dogs that kind of look like him, right, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a beautiful looking husky, right? Then all of a sudden I look at like a pug, right, with their bug eyes and their goofy faces and their overbite, and I'm like, yeah, you're cute, but do I find you as aesthetically pleasing as a husky? Or with especially huskies with like the bright blue eyes. Oh my God, right? Super cute. Totes adorbs. So yeah, we have different ideas about what is attractive, right? And that comes down to who we find attractive as well. What are the predominant themes within our society in which we find people attractive? And that can have a huge impact on who we look for love. Even though you might find someone that on a personal level, on a professional level, might be a better match, we still focus so much on how people look that plenty of people have gone out and gotten married based on their attractiveness rather than the the actual substance of their relationship and the substance of the people. So that can have a huge impact on a community, on what we consider to be beautiful. What about buildings, right? Are buildings beautiful? They can be, right? They can be very artistic. They can be very functional, right? Some people look at different types of buildings and have nostalgia, right? I love old Western towns, right? I love going to old Western towns and seeing like, cool brick or wooden structures that line the streets. I think that is super cool. I hate suburbia, right? I can't stand houses that all look the same, right? Even if aesthetically they're pleasing, right? Aesthetically they're pleasing. They might have very interesting lines and they might be very functional and they might have, cool windows and be an interesting design in and of itself. But when combined with house after house after house after house after house after house, does it lose its beauty? Maybe a little bit. So one of the things that we have to talk about when we're dealing with Western art is this sort of idea of like universal art or the universal gaze that a few people came up with. If we look at Immanuel Kant or Hegel, they believe that there is this universal gaze that all humans have, that all humans share, and that they believe that they think this is what is beautiful. And everyone would agree with that. And I don't agree with that at all. And most anthropologists aren't going to agree with that idea either, that there is this universal gaze. And we understand that culture itself determines what we find to be attractive, and various cultures are going to agree or disagree with what we might consider to be attractive. So universal gaze isn't necessarily a real thing, but it has been highly influential, especially within Western culture, right? Because we have determined what is aesthetically pleasing, what is beautiful, and how we organize that can be very influential on how we consider things to be like fine art versus like popular art. You know, if we're talking about fine art, how do we display fine art, right? How do we display it? Well, oftentimes fine art is displayed in places like art galleries. And art galleries are designed in a very specific way. They're designed so that you might have a wall, and on this wall it might be completely white, right? There's nothing there, right? It's all blank. And then you will have either the artwork, you know, maybe a painting or a photograph or a sculpture or something like that, and it'll have its own space, right? It'll have its own space. And it's alone, right? We allow us to focus on this one thing, and that's what makes it important. And we also have this ability to limit the information given on that piece of art. Have you ever gone into like an art house or something like that, and you go up to a piece of art and you're looking at the sort of description of it, and it's like 2 or 3 lines of information about that piece of art. It gives you nothing about the artwork, right? And that's kind of this idea that for it to be good artwork, you have to go in and observe it in its natural, unfettered state, with no information that you have to determine as an individual how important this piece of art actually is. And that's how we know that it's fine, because you have to work at it. You have to work at finding why that piece of art is, in fact, important. So that's often what happens with fine art, right? This very minimalist approach, limited audience, right? Not everyone is going to go to an art gallery or an art house and access this art just for art's sake, right? Just to experience that art. Most people don't have the time. They've got other things to do, right? Or they don't have access to it, right? Maybe they can't afford to go onto that, you know. So, you know, and that's why events like what is that? Friday Art Walk, or I know we do that here. First Friday. Here in Denver, pre-COVID, we had First Friday, right? And that's where people would go up and down various streets like Santa Fe or Broadway or Brighton Boulevard, and they'd go around and they'd look at all these different art houses. They'd go to Rhino and go in, and these places were open to the public, right? It was a great time to be able to go out and experience this art. But that's, you know, one day in a month. So again, access, right? Let's see. When we think about sort of this Western culture, this fine art, what are the things that we oftentimes consider to be really important? You know, that it's original, right? It has to have some sort of originality, something unique to it. And if we can find that, then we can say, yeah, this is really important. This is really important because this is unique, right? And the more unique it is, the more special it becomes. We have high sort of high standards for what is considered to be artistic, right? I can sit down and sketch something out and look at it and say, yeah, that's a piece of art. And we can have an art critic come up and say, yeah, that's a piece of garbage, right? Because that's not a very good depiction of an elephant. That looks more like a monkey. And I'd be like, it could be both, right? It's unique. No, it doesn't work like that, right? We have certain standards of what, an elephant is supposed to look like, right? And the better that we can draw that elephant, right? The better, the more detail that we can put into it, or the more unique idea or impact that we can have on this piece of art is seen as superior. My goofy little drawing isn't necessarily going to be considered artistic. It's just going to be, whatever. So how we get to that level of truly being artistic can be a barrier, right? You can do art, but we might not necessarily consider it artistic, right? So we also have to understand what is considered to be like the apex arts. So we're going to be talking about fine art here. We talked a little bit about like the going to the orchestra and the ballet, why these things are so important. And a lot of times it has to do with being sort of restrictive, right? Being exclusive, having access to these things, and also how they are performed, right? There's no knocking an orchestra for being able to play in such an amazing piece of artwork, and especially because it's probably being, it was probably written by like Bach or Mozart, who that everybody loves Bach and Mozart, right? Because they were some of the greats and they made this great music hundreds of years ago, and we still get to listen to it, and it's amazing. And so we put that as sort of like the apex. And the question that I ask is whether or not that violin or viola player is better than, let's say, somebody playing in a rock band that has spent the same amount of time learning their instrument and playing that music, but it's consumed differently, right? One of the things that when I was a young man, Metallica came out with some songs where they incorporated like an orchestral style music into their rock, right? Into their music. It was like, yeah, it's like, you got rock and roll, you got orchestra. I mean, this is like the combination of awesomeness, right? Was it? The concept here is that we are combining the fine art with the popular art. And what it's doing is it's raising that popular art to, at least close to the same level as we hold like the orchestral, the fine art, and being able to bring these two together makes it something special, right? Rather than just rock, right? More than just a few guitars and some drums and a long-haired, rock and roller singing and yelling and having a good time, yeah, But who's to say that's any less than an orchestral piece, or a quartet? What makes them different? And again, it becomes that we have to understand how they become exclusive and why one is held up as another. And a lot of times it has to do with, again, access and where that music is played, right? Orchestral music oftentimes also has a religious connotation to it, right? It might have been written for, or some sort of religious concept, or written for a king or a queen, or something like that, right? But there might be some aspect of religion that might come into it, and because oftentimes, especially in Western culture and the United States, religion is such a huge value of our system, right? It's part of our ideals. When you go to church and you hear like choir music, or you hear some sort of orchestral music, it has that contact, right? That sense that this is what's important. And that rock and roll, right, is a little bit more rebellious. And I say rebellious in the context that rock and roll is not rebellious at all now. Right now, there are way more rock and roll stations than there are classical music stations. Right? In Denver, there's like one classical music station. How many rock and roll stations are there? How many country music stations are there? How many easy listening stations? God, I hate easy listening. Ugh. Anyway, why do we have just one? Right? Why is there just one classical station? So, and that's kind of where we come into the popular music, right? Because now we've got a whole bunch of stuff that everybody enjoys, everybody has access to. So when you're out there looking at artwork, when you're listening to music, when you're going to a restaurant and you're looking at what you're about to consume, right? Ask those questions. Is this popular? Is this fine? Right? Is this the apex of what I am listening to? Right? Are the Beatles the greatest ever? I would say no. I would say Led Zeppelin is. There are going to be some arguments on that, I'm sure. Or the Rolling Stones, right? So when you're out there looking at this stuff, when you're analyzing it, when you're in a different culture and you're looking at their artwork and what they see as popular and what they see as fine, try and understand why. Why is that the case? Let's talk about primitive art for a second. Primitive art is this concept in which we sometimes devalue art. And we do this in different ways. It's how it's consumed. Oftentimes we see primitive art, and primitive art can be seen and is oftentimes associated with this, and it drives me nuts. But in our country, a lot of times like Native American art is seen as primitive, right? Because it's not refined. It's not, and I'm not saying that it isn't, but that's the approach that some people have. It isn't a part of the Western gaze, right? That Western idealism of artwork. So what happens is that oftentimes we see Native American artwork end up in museums. And we have to understand sort of like the difference between like an art gallery versus like a museum. An art gallery is someplace that you are drawn to experience this art, right? It's an exclusive thing. It's seen as new or fresh or very, very interesting. It's creative, right? If you go to a museum and you look at art, oftentimes, especially if it's like the Museum of Nature and Science, or any other museum that has Native American stuff, oftentimes it's seen as found art, right? Discovered art. It has been captured or collected, and it's how the art is displayed, and it gives like a description of who the artists were at the time, or the type of pottery and what it was used for, or anything like that. We change the context of that art. Instead of looking at it through the fine art lens, right, that we would see other fine art, we see it through a different lens, this primitive lens, that the people that made it weren't as cultured as Western society, which we know is not the case, right? But the general context in which Western culture has taken this is just, it's ridiculous. So we look at how people consume this artwork, right? Whether or not it is fine art and how it gets displayed. And fine art is seen as this apex, this thing to achieve. You've got your popular art, the thing that you consume the most of. And then you have primitive art, which is more of an oddity, or something that's exotic, right? It's exotic. It's outside of the Western cultural norm, and we're going to display it in a museum. And that's how we can oftentimes look at how a culture might view its own people or its neighbors, right? If you have a culture that, you have two cultures that live next to each other, okay? And in this culture, we've got fine art, popular art, and primitive art. And their primitive art looks a whole lot like this culture's popular art. What do you think that's saying about this culture right here? This culture right here is saying, like, your art, your popular art over here, yeah, it ain't so great, right? It's not nearly as good as our popular art or our fine art, right? Our art is way better, and we just consider your art to be like not cool. Or at least not as good as the rest of our art, right? So how people place artwork into these different subcategories can give us an insight into how they see that population, right? And to see their neighbors. And you can see also artwork change as you approach borders. So if we're talking about two different nations here, we can start to see how art is going to change depending on where you live, right? We talk about Southwestern art. Well, Southwestern art and art from Mexico are going to be more similar because of their geographical location and their shared geographical location, versus Southwestern art and, say, art coming out of the Northeast, right, out of New York. It's going to be different, right? And we see that because of that geological location, that there is more similarity going on here, even though there is a border, right, and there are distinct cultures on either side. Maybe they're not all that distinct, right? There's a mixing that's going on. So, we're going to see a different approach to that kind of artwork, depending on where you live. Okay, I'm going to take this moment to give you guys a break, and then we'll start up again in a few minutes.